For the purpose of the recording, I'm just introducing Dr. Karen Bisley to talk about extreme heat guidelines and the Croaky Australia policy. Thanks, Karen.
Okay, thanks, Kate. Now I'm talking about croquet and heat. Somebody did ask about the cold, and I'll briefly talk about that at the end, but the main focus of this talk is heat. So just having just a general talk. So our summers can be long and hot, and it's not surprising that we get temperatures 35, 40 degrees plus, and over time our temperatures are actually getting hotter. So we really have to be considering temperature, really important for croquet. And what we have to think about is this is just an arbitrary number, is not saying this is anything particular, but 35 degrees in Perth, it can be completely different to 35 degrees in Brisbane. And this is because in Perth, they have like a dry heat and low humidity, whereas Brisbane, it's a more moist heat and high humidity. And when we've got high humidity, it restricts evaporation. So we can't evaporate as much. So as I briefly said, I'm going to talk about mostly heat. At the end, I'm going to mention about sun smart, because that's a little bit different to heat, but I'll just mention it because there's a new Australian Sports Commission policy that's come out on sun smart. And I'm just going to go through, there's lots of considerations we have to consider, is where is it, the time of year, the time of day, the length of exposure. So, we could be playing for 2 hours, we could be playing for 6 or 7 hours. We also have to think about the code, because different codes have different times that people are on the lawn, and also there are other factors we'll consider shortly. It's also think about it at club level versus regional or national, so that they're going to differ. Also singles versus doubles. So if you're singles, you're going to be on the lawn all the time. If it's doubles, you may not be on the lawn. And gateball has teams, so potentially they can be standing in the shade while they're waiting if there happens to be shade there. Not only we have to consider players, but there's also the referees and spectators. And unfortunately, a lot of the demographics of the croquet population are over 65, and about that stage, we lose our ability to sweat as well. So we're not as good, as efficient as keeping ourselves cool. So heat generates from another number of areas, and in bodies, we can really think of, we generate heat by running, but for croquet, we're mostly standing there, walking around. There's the odd young person that might run, but generally we're not making a lot of heat from standing around. It's going to be environmental factors, and we'll talk about those soon. We cool by sweating. So I'll just start. So firstly, we have to think about where and the time of the year. So I just talked about Queensland versus Perth, but it could be Queensland versus Tasmania. It doesn't really matter. So essentially, people in Queensland are going to be used to the heat. The people in Tasmania are not going to be used to the heat. And if we've got a tournament that's happening in Queensland and the Tasmanians are going to visit Queensland, they're going to notice the heat a lot more. The time of year is important, because obviously summer is the biggest time we're going to have heat risk issues. Winter is less likely to be an issue, but if we happen to be playing in Darwin, which really there's no clubs in Darwin that I know of, it's not going to be such an issue. But autumn and spring can be variable. So can the length of exposure that we're out in the sun, and I'll talk about that shortly. So this is just comparing the Interstate Shield in 2018 and 2025. So we're in the same location and the same time of year, both events, yet during 2018 we had a number of people with heat stress, and then this year the weather was cooler, and we had no issues with any heat stress because the temperatures were very different. So it's very hard to even predict, particularly in the spring and autumn, of what we're going to get. The length of exposure, or i.e. the length of time we're out on the lawns, is also important. So if we're doing club games, we may be out there for 1 to 2 hours. If we're doing a tournament, particularly GC, we could be out there for a lot longer. The codes are important, and the location at the time of when we're playing is important. So I've just sort of tried to break the codes down. So GC, approximately 1 hour per game. So at club level, you may be playing 2 to 3 games and then go home. And people will often break in the middle of the games, sit down for 5 minutes before they go out again. In competition, you could be out there for 6 to 7 games per day. AC and ricochet, you could be approximately 2 hours per game. Club level, you might get 1 game per day. At competition, it could be 3. Gate ball, it's only 30 minutes per game. And depending on whether it's club, you may have 3, 4 games. At competition, you may have 5, 6. So there's so many factors that vary depending on which code we're playing. So the other things I've talked about is the difference between singles, where you have to be on the lawn all the time. Doubles, potentially you could be standing off the lawn in shelter, but if you're playing a competition match, you may want to be standing next to your partner so you know what's happening and discussing tactics. Yeah, AC and ricochet, potentially you can have off lawn time and be in the shade. The problem is the better the player you are, the longer you're going to be on the lawn and less ability to have any shade. Gate ball, again, we've talked about just a minute ago, but there's differences between singles and teams, etc., of how long you're going to be standing out. But they tend to only go for 30 minutes, so you're getting breaks between the games. So here's Canberra Croquet Club. So at the top, this is lawn 3, and this could be so if this was summer, and the bottom is lawn 1. So if this was summer, you've got a say 35-degree day, and it'd be very stinking hot on lawn 1 down the bottom. But in the afternoon, lawn 3 is in the shade, and it's a lot more pleasant. And during summer, everybody wants to play on lawn 3. During winter, nobody wants to play on lawn 3. So we have quite a bit of difference just in our lawns, and that's important to consider. So I'm just going to talk about heat stress before I get on to the actual heat tool, but everybody's at risk. So you've got the players who are out there standing for a long period of time, and officials, particularly the referees, who can be sitting in the sun for quite a few hours, but there's also spectators. I briefly mentioned children and pregnant women. At the moment, it's unclear whether heat stress is an issue with children. They're actually doing some research at the moment, and there's going to be heat guidelines out or adjustments for children next year. And again, pregnant women, it doesn't seem that there's any thermoregulatory capacity being compromised for them. So back to the demographics. So a lot of people are over 65, and as I said, if you're over 65, potentially less ability to sweat, and if you're unfit, again, more risk of heat stress. If you've got underlying medical issues such as heart or kidney problems, or you've been recently sick, or you're taking medications which impair sweating, and this can be things like some of the antidepressants, again, it's putting you at more risk of heat stress. So it potentially means you have reduced ability to respond to the heat. The other factors that can be problematic is if you're overweight or you're unacclimatized, such as the Tasmanians heading up to Queensland to play in the Interstate Shield. So referees and observers, I've said it's important to consider these people. The reason I put Jim here is obviously he passed away recently, but he was involved. I was involved with him a few years ago, trying to sort of work out some sort of heat guidelines for croquet. So I've been mucking about and trying to get some sort of ideas for quite a few years, and so has Jim. So at competition level, the referees can actually be on the lawn the longest. Often they're older, they no longer play, and they don't appreciate that they're getting dehydrated. They can be sitting in the sun, and there may be less shade. So the important thing is that you can lose about 2% of your body weight before you actually feel as though you're thirsty. So if people are sitting there in the sun, they just may not be aware they're getting dehydrated. So along with the players, which I'll talk about, we have to consider making sure that referees get breaks, they have plenty of drinks, they get regular rotations, and we need to be providing them sun shelters or some sort of shade. They also need to be wearing appropriate clothes, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So I'll talk about heat stress or hypothermia. So basically, heat stress is being too hot. Our normal temperature is about 37.2, and as we get hotter, most of the time we start having more difficulty with various symptoms, and I'll go through that in a second. So when we're too hot, that can be because of strenuous exercise, which is unlikely in croquet, but it can be most likely due to prolonged exposure to the heat. We have things called symptoms, and that's the way you feel, and signs are what other people observe of you. And you can have mild symptoms through to severe symptoms. So the severe being when people become unconscious and collapse and unconscious. And I'll go through that now. So heat exhaustion. So probably that's the most common. So yeah, you may feel weak, dizzy, nausea, vomiting. You may have cramps, headaches, or feeling very sweaty. Signs that other people may see is that if they checked your pulse, it could be thready. You may have dry skin. And that's because you get to a point, you sweat, then your sweating is no longer able to happen, and you start getting hot, dry skin. You may look pale and clammy, and most of these things are with people less than 40 degrees. As you get hotter, you become confused, you have brain fog, and other people may notice that you're confused, you're unsteady, you become agitated, altered level of consciousness, seizures, or coma. And so that's in the extreme settings. I think, the confusion and the agitation are really important, because I think whether it's a referee or official at a croquet tournament, if they start seeing somebody saying, looking agitated, irrational, I think that's an indication that somebody needs to be able to say, okay, look, I don't think you're fit enough to continue, that you need to come off. The problem is well, with other sports, if they say no, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong with me, they get irritated and agitated. But I teach the rugby girls, if I say, if you become agitated and aggressive and don't talk to me rationally, that's an indication that you're getting confused, so you're off. So I think that's a really important message to be teaching people, saying, look, we're just checking up on you. If you answer appropriately and tell us, that you're okay, well, continuing on. But if they're agitated and aggressive at you, maybe we're going to have to say, look, that's probably an indication that you should not be playing. And this is something we may have to think about in the future, particularly for tournaments and things. So how do we treat hypothermia? So we have to identify it, so they're confused and all the things that I've just talked about. If they collapse, people vary in their response. They may be really good, and then they can become really unwell very quickly. And the important thing is being able to identify, oh, it's a really stinking hot day, they've just become confused, they've just collapsed. So I think if that sort of thing happens, obviously you're calling an ambulance, but you need to be thinking of heat stroke or a heat-related illness. The important thing is, and I'll get back to that in a second, the important thing is we don't just call the ambulance. We need to do something while we're waiting. So treatment of heat illness, it really just depends on the severity. So just, people who are a bit hot, feeling a bit dizzy, lightheaded, the best thing we can do is get out of the sun, stay in a cool area. Have things like an air conditioning or a fan or shade. If they're feeling really dizzy, you can lie them down and put their feet up. The important thing is strip the clothes off them. You can wet them down, put cold towels around them or cold towels on their skin. In an ideal world, they have ice baths these days so that you can jump in to cool down quickly, and that's really important. And we don't exactly have ice baths in croquet, but we may have a hose. We can pour water over or squirt the person with a hose to cool them down. If we don't have that, we have ice packs that we can put in their groins, armpits, and neck. And the important thing is don't let them have alcohol or any coffee, because that is going to cause dehydration, and that's going to cause further dehydration. So if symptoms are becoming worse, you're going to be calling for help. So I talked about the ambulance. So the most important thing is, while you ring the ambulance, don't stop. You should be cooling that person down. You want to get their temperature down. You can be, squirting them with water, putting the ice packs on, and doing everything you can, because you want to get them cool before they get into the ambulance. If they become unconscious and stop breathing, we're going to have to go through the airway, breathing, circulation, and start CPR, which I won't get into at the moment. But it's really important, as I've mentioned, to treat them as hypothermia if they're hot. So the important thing, I've written it down as individuals. So be prepared. Individuals, you need to be fit. If you're not fit, you're at much more risk of heat stress. And as I've mentioned, individual responses vary. So what can you do to try and improve your preparation? You can expose yourself to the heat. So maybe play 45 to 90 minutes a day in the heat just to get used to it. But it can take anywhere between 5 to 14 days to acclimatize to the heat. So if you're playing somewhere like the Interstate Shield, heading to Queensland, not used to the heat because we've had a cold time in Canberra, or for the Tasmanians, 5 days, 14 days extra to actually acclimatise is not always practical. So the other thing is, on the day of the tournament, avoid extended exposure to the heat. So if you arrive and it's 30 degrees, you don't want to be going out there and practicing before the tournament, because all you're going to do is get yourself hot before it even starts. So the important thing is, don't have a quick warm up, don't spend too long in the heat. The important thing is hydrate, and it's not only hydrating on the day. You want to be hydrating like the day before, making sure you've drunk plenty of fluids the day before. You want to be cutting down on your coffee, but 500 mils is recommended 1 to 2 hours before event. You can pre-cool, so you can use cold water, you can ice slushies, you can use ice vests or immerse yourself into cold water. Anything to try and get your core temperature down before you get into the heat. So simple actions do make a difference. So it's important, is lightweight, breathable, loose clothing, and a hat. Frequent breaks and seeking shade. And if there's a problem, delay or cancel the tournament. But we'll talk about that in a moment. So talking about club pay, obviously there's a lot more older people, and the time of year, particularly spring and autumn, it can vary, but summer can be hot. So just thinking about the lawn in Canberra, obviously in lawn 1, where there was no sun, people are going to get a lot hotter, and lawn 3 is obviously the ideal lawn on a hot day. So we need to consider the older people. And interesting enough, I find it really fascinating that Canberra plays in the middle of the day, or not in the middle of the day. So like on a Saturday, they'll play AC 10 till 12, and then GC will be being played at between 1 p.m. to 3 to 4 p.m., which is often the hottest part of the day. And when we've got peaks in the middle of the day, I'm sort of wondering why we actually play in the middle of the day in the middle of summer. Obviously, it's not a problem all the time, but particularly in January, December, January, as we're coming up to, it may be much more smart to be playing in the evenings. But this is a discussion point, and we don't have that hot temperature all the time. And it may be, okay, the temperature is too hot, the lawns are closed. There may be things that we can do. So it's things to think about in your clubs. The important bit is, I think, be proactive. You could have a club member who's a heat monitor. They can check the heat guidelines. If it's too hot, say the lawns are closed, and they'll be opening at 5 o'clock or something. If play during club, they need to make sure there's rest breaks and people are out of the sun when they're not playing. Having access to fluids, ice, fans, and cooling is important. So this is Florida, which is where we were with the under 21s earlier in the year. And I was asking, I said, how do you manage heat in Florida? And it's quite interesting. So does anybody know what these birds are? So these are I think snowbirds, and this is what they call the people who live in Florida. Well, the transient people. So the Americans will go to Florida for the winter and spend their winter in Florida, and then they head back north for the summer. And I said, well, how much croquet do you play? They play, but it's often in the mornings, and they don't have any tournaments during summer in Florida. So measurements of thermal heat, stress, etc. So I've talked about us like not generating as much heat as a runner, but there's environmental factors to consider. So it's the temperature which the sun produces, but also the humidity, and those two things we've talked about. But wind is also really important. So if you've got a nice breeze, like a cool sea breeze or something, that obviously will cool things down significantly. The other factors are important, the sun from the surfaces, but also the surroundings. So if you've got a nice tree belt that is providing shade, that is going to make a difference too. And the heat tool will give you information about the general location, but very specific locations such as the Canberra Croquet Club at 4 p.m. on the afternoon, where you've got one lawn in the shade and one in the sun. It's not going to give us those regional details, but that could vary about 8 degrees between those two locations. In the past, we've dealt with ambient apparent temperature or wet bulb globe thermometer, but these are only, like on the Bond website, they don't even use them regularly now. These are often estimated readings. And as I've said, between the two different locations, one number doesn't give you all the answers. So as we know, the high humidity, it makes cooling less effective. And the other thing is, I mentioned, is we're going to have to think about our clothes, but we'll get back to that. So how do we plan an event? So we can do this individually, or we can do this as like a tournament manager. So I've just pulled up the President's 8 because that's coming up. So this is the event. I've chosen GC, and the timing obviously depends on the discipline. So if we're playing GC, we're going to play 6 to 7 games per day. Where is it? Canley. The time of year is going to be February, when potentially it could be very hot, and it will be over 3 days and up to 6 games again. And in this time, I really think we have to be considering whether we have some wiggle room for the hot weather. And when I say wiggle room, I just mean that you may have to have an extra day, or make sure there is a little bit extra time that people can play, because if we're in the middle of the day and it's stinking hot, really it's not the ideal thing. So maybe we have to have a 3.5 day tournament rather than just a 3 day tournament to try and allow for these things. However, there are things we can do. The other one I looked up is just the under 21s in Tasmania, which is coming up in January. So in Hobart, we should not have a problem because the average temperature is not that hot there. However, I've been to Adelaide, where we've had under 21 competition in January, and it's been 40+ degrees. I've been in West Australia, and I've forgotten the name of the place, just north of Perth, and it's been in the mid-30s and quite comfortable because there's been a sea breeze. So temperature is not exact, but we have to look at potential competitions and things. So what we can do is we can monitor the weather like a week before, and we can try and figure out what to do. So we're managing, as I said, if the tournament's too hot, we can try and allow some flexibility. You know, do we have an extra day? Do we start earlier? Do we have a siesta in the middle of the day? Do we finish later? And we need to make sure we've got precautions for cooling, such as shelters, fans, water, ice, those things available. So traditionally, we've looked up the website or used a handheld device. However, we have been looking, and we've been looking at the heat tool, and this is really where I'm coming to at this point. So this is the sports medicine heat tool, and it's been designed for all sports and everywhere. So it's algorithms, and it bases all the information off the local BOM website. So you need to put in your details, and I'll go through this with you, but you put in your details of where you are and what sport, and it will come out with the risk of that sport. So there's been about 3 versions of it. What they do is they break down different sports into the risks. So walking is obviously low risk. Then we're not mentioned of the 30 sports, which is a bit sad. But I've been putting croquet at about the level of bowls and golf. However, you know, we could sort of argue, particularly when you're doing a long GC games and you're out there all day for the whole day, you know, maybe we should be up there, you know, towards cricket. You know, I haven't got exact answer on this one, but at the moment I'm using classification 2. So the sports classification, this is sort of more the traditional thing. So you can see the classification 2, which is the bowls/golf, and the green is the no problem zone, the moderate is the moderate risk, the high, and then the extreme. And in the red zone, we really shouldn't be playing. So when you look at it for cricket, there's the movement of the graph is just a little bit to the left. So it's not a lot different, but there is a slight variation. So we're focusing on classification 2. And we don't have to worry about this anymore. But this is comparing a couple of days, you know, the 6th of December when we had a hot day, just comparing bowls versus cricket and their heat stratification, and there wasn't a lot of difference between the 2 graphs. You know, both of them showed the yellow, the low risk, and then up to the moderate risk. So they both identified the same things about the same time. So I think we're quite happy to stick with bowls at the moment. So now, this is just a scenario, and I can't remember this. This was Tempe on the 9th of December. So as you can see, the temperature at Tempe increased quite quickly, and by 10 o'clock, it was actually in the moderate zone. By midday, it was in the starting to get into the red zone, and that really stayed there until about 4 p.m. And if we've got a tournament that's happening in this time, or club play, you know, like such as having playing in the early afternoon when we're hitting the extreme pieces, this is where I say this is the time that it's not ideal. So I don't, you know, in the other times, in the yellow zone and the orange zone, we can still, people can play, but it's taking precautions. But at the red zone, I say that's the time we need to try and avoid. So the heat sports tool is actually designed initially for the Australian Open for the tennis players, and it's been made by a group up in Sydney through the Heat and Health Research Centre. It's really easy to use, It can be used on computers or on phones, and it gives us real-time data information every hour, and it uses the local bomb weather information. So, and it's available anywhere in Australia. And we can also look at it for up to a week ahead. The important thing is, so if we and I'll show you how to work in a second. So we need to make sure we put in the right location, because if you put the wrong location in, it doesn't help you. And it's also really important for Sydney. So we can actually, you can look up Tempe and it will put Tempe in. You can look up Kenley, it will put Kenley in. If you put Toronto, it puts Toronto in. So it's really, really location specific. And that's actually going to be really important, particularly in places like Sydney, where the variation in Sydney can be quite great depending on whereabouts in Sydney you are. So it's going to be important to put in the correct location of where you are, and also the correct sport, which at the moment is bowl/golf. And what it does is actually provides advice about what to do in the various temperatures. So if it's low, moderate, severe, or extreme, and it tells you what to do. So at the moment, it only tells us on that day of how we manage it. So we can look up today's results. It will tell us this is what we do today. At the moment, it doesn't tell us, okay, this is going to be what it's like in 7 days' time and how to manage that. But that may come with future. But there are ways of sorting that out too. So this is the Sports Heat tool. And if you just look up Sports Heat tool, SMA Sports Heat tool, that's going to come up and you'll be able to find it. So you can download the tool easy enough, and it's worth putting it on your phone and computers and being able to use it. So I'm just, sorry, I've just got something out of order here, so I'll get back. So anyway, it will go through different categories, and we can look it up and it will show us what it is. I might just flick forward a bit and get back to it. So this is what the Sports Heat tool looks like, and you can see on the left I've put in bowls, I've put in the location Tempe, and then it comes up with the location of when I looked it up. It said it was low, the risk of any heat stress was low. So it says the recommendations were stay hydrated and wear light clothing. So it will tell us those risk factors for all the different things. So if you look here, you can see the green areas. It's just telling us hydrate and modify clothing. So wearing light weight clothing and remove excess layers. And I think generally as croquet players, we're mostly sensible about this sort of thing. When it gets into the yellow zone, we don't have to stop, but we just have to maybe add some rest breaks in, having more frequent, maybe a rest break, and making sure there's cooling available. When it gets to the orange zone, we have to be having active cooling strategies, which may be the fans, spending a bit of time out of the heat from time to time. When it gets to the red, it's stopping exercise. And they've broken down this information even further. So I'll just quickly go through the different areas. So we've talked about the green, and it says things like, it tells you, the best thing you can do is, beforehand, hydrate. Tells you if you're 70 mils, 70 kilos, how much to have. And it's important to hydrate before, during, and afterwards. Clothing modifications, wearing light colors, breathable fabrics, having good ventilation, and having wet towels. So that's the thing about, you can have a towel around your neck to try and help cool you down. The Sun Smart is important, and I'll talk about that briefly at the end, but having a broad brim hat, the long sleeves or the sleeves for UV protection and sunscreen are important. But just remember, sunscreen doesn't impede sweating, so that's important to be aware of. So when we get to the yellow zone, that's when we start having to have the rest periods. So we're having to look at having rest periods. When we were in Adelaide, we had 5-minute rest breaks every half an hour during play. So they would actually stop, make sure the kids were hydrated, had some water, and then continue on. And then they had icy poles available between the breaks. But, it might be that we just say, okay, on a stinking hot day, we have to stop at half an hour for at appropriate time, non-critical, for a 2-minute break where you can grab some water, make sure you're out of the sun for a few minutes and get some water, and then continue on. Other possibilities are that you may have to decrease the length of the game. So instead of saying, okay, we're out there for an hour and a quarter maximum, and then you come in for a bit of break, by people doing their cards, those sorts of things, it'll probably take at least 10 minutes, and they can spend that time in the cool. So it doesn't necessarily have to affect the tournaments much, but it can make a difference to players. So the important thing is having shelter available. So in some clubs, you might have the natural trees, etc., or permanent shelters. But as we saw in Toronto, they had permanent shelters, but they sort of sheltered the lawn behind the croquet lawn half the day, then not actually on the lawn. The other thing is making sure we're providing water for the players, and most clubs are really good at that. We get into the orange zone. So this is where the risk of heat stress becomes even higher. So you have to start doing your active cooling. So you can still play, but you have to be looking at things like the cold water, the ice slushies, the cool neck towels, dousing yourself with water, spray bottles, anything you can do. And then, if you're off the lawn, standing in front of a fan, using a water misting system, or just cooling yourself down. And just some people, I have seen this before, people are using something like menthol to cool them down. It doesn't work. So this is just if we got to this stage, so we can see, as I've shown you, is we should really be suspending play in this situation between when it hits the red zone. So that 10 o'clock to 3 o'clock. So if we're in the middle of a tournament, we can probably keep playing, but the yellow won't be a problem. The moderate we can manage, but if you're getting to that red zone, that's really important. And that's really important so that when we look at the event coming ahead, to see what it's going to be. If we know we're going to have one day like this, that's where we may have to look at starting earlier, starting at 7 o'clock, trying to get in a few games beforehand, having the siesta in the middle of the day and then playing in the evening, or having that extra day available to be able to play with. So this is I just observed what was happening before and after the Champion of Champions. And so this was the 21st to the 23rd of November. So you can see I've put in the sport, which was bowls, and the location was in Tempe. And it gives you a little map so you know where it is. So when I looked it up, it just said the risk was low, keep hydrated, and wear light clothing, which was pretty normal. So this was the prediction. And the Champion of Champions went from the Friday through to the Sunday. And so there was a couple of days, the Wednesday and Thursday, we got to moderate risk, but they weren't playing that day. So there wasn't such a concern. So looking ahead for the forecast, the Friday, Saturday and Sunday looks like there was going to be low risk. So that's one thing we can automatically do ahead of time to see if there's going to be an issue. Then so we're predicting, so this is the Friday, and of course, that's what it looked like through the day, and there was no risk. So the Saturday also showed very similar. We got to the Sunday, and evidently it was quite warm, and then they had quite a bit of rain during the middle of day, and this really put the humidity up. So the heat risk went from a low level to a moderate level. And talking to Ethan, he said it was really horrible during this time, but I think that's really important to say. So this is where you start having to use the active cooling and trying to keep the players cool. So I'm not sure, I wasn't there, but whether they actually sort of encouraged them to get out the sun, did some many cooling strategies, etc. But that's where you'd be thinking of it at that point. So I'm not going through it, but for each session, the sports tool actually starts giving you information about what you can do to try and help keep the cooling. So that was in that weekend. So you can go onto the heat tool. It tells you what to do, which is what mostly we've talked about. So this is the scenario. If we'd gone to this temperature on that date, we would have hit that high zone, which luckily they didn't. But if it had happened and they got into the red zone, really they should have been having to stop play between 11 and 4, which practically can be a bit of a nuisance when you've got a croquet tournament that's meant to be finishing. But it's the important thing is trying to keep player safety. And into this reading of the high reading, this is when people, for prolonged exposure, are at high risk of getting hyperthermia and can get quite sick. So what you'll find is the majority of time, we're never going to get to the red zone. It's only actually a small percentage of time. The rest of the time, we're going to be in the yellow or the orange zone. So the heat tool, I can show you a little bit later, but I'll just get through this bit first, and I can happily show you how it works in real time if you want, if I can manage that. So my other question is long term, whether we should be doing any research, and I can talk about that more. But there are pills which other codes have used about getting people to swallow pills and measuring what's happening in their core temperature when they're out there for long periods of time. And I've been doing this, trying to work this out in reverse at the moment with some research I'm trying to do. So the other thing I'll briefly mention is the SunSafe Sports, and I've recommended this to Croquet Australia. This has just been put out this year by the AIS, and it's quite simple, but we know a lot of bits and pieces, but I think it's a good article, and I've really given you a 2-page summary. So in Australia, we've got the highest skin cancer in the world. So 2 out of 3 Australians are diagnosed with skin cancer, and everybody's at risk. And the longer you're outdoors and increase in the exposure to the UV radiation, obviously the greater risk. So that's important, because you might be out there for an hour and a half, but if we're out there for even longer periods of time, you're at a greater risk. And the AIS is recommending that sports organisations have to have a duty of care in safe environments, including the UV radiation, and there has to be prevention strategies. So this is probably a summary, which is I quite like it. This is the hierarchy of controls. So first top is the elimination, the physical hazard. Can we remove it? Can we remove the sun being outdoors? No, we can't. So substitution, the second one. Can we replace the hazard? Can we go indoors and do that for croquet? No, we can't. So we're on to number 3. Can we engineer controls? I.e., can we get people away from it? So can we provide shade? Yes, we can. We can't, in an ideal world, we might be able to one day have big shade cloths across lawns and providing shade. It's a possibility. But what we can do is provide shelters when people are not in the lawns, and they can try and stand in the shelters at other times. So having shelters available. Then there's the administration controls, and these are the things. Can we change the way people work? Is there a UV policy? Communication and reminders regularly shared. Have staff or people in the club been trained in Safe Smart? And can events be scheduled better to reduce the exposure? So very similar to the heat stuff. And we're back to the PPE, which is personal protection. So I think we're pretty good at that. In croquet, we can use our whites, we can have our hats, we can use our arm sleeves to try and be sun smart. And and I've done just that. It's made it a little bit easier to read. But here is me trying to be sun smart, trying to cover up and sort of things that we can do. And I've written down most of this, and I don't think I really have to go over it all in detail, but being sun smart is really important. It's the hat, it's the clothes, it's the breathing, and using sunscreen and having a drink bottle with you. So the last picture, the last question somebody asked me was about croquet in the cold, and I didn't realize, but they do actually play croquet in the snow in a few countries. So really, with croquet in the cold, it's basically sensible treatment, such as wearing, if it's wet, you wear a good quality raincoat. You have multiple layers, particularly wool. You want your arms and legs. You want a woolly hat. You have your waterproof over trousers and over shoes. You may need hand warmers for your pockets to keep your hands warm when you're not playing. Have towels available, and extra clothes and shoes for changes in clothes if you get wet. So I'll theoretically stop sharing.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Karen. So we're just after 6, but we started a bit late. So I thought I would take us for another 10 minutes so we can get to some of those questions that we've got. Very much appreciated the information that you've already covered. Marty was interested in how to use the wet bulb if you wanted to do it yourself. Is that a way to go, or?
Yeah, that you can use it gets a little bit more complicated these days. So wet bulb is not perfect, and if you do use it, you need a high quality wet bulb thermometer, and it's not something that I've been pushing, because it's giving you a one number, whereas I think heat stress and you're working within those zones is probably more important. So if you use the heat, am I shared at the moment, or of unshared? So
you're unshared. Yeah.
Back to that graph at the very near the beginning, where it showed the different codes. You have to actually look up the number, and then you have to find out the air temperature and the humidity, and then put it into the graph to find out where it sits on that level. So you actually have to still use some sort of manual task to try and figure out where it is. So it's a lot more complicated than being able to just use the app and look at it.
Okay, and sorry, Gary's asked about responsibility to stop play, which I think we've said in the end it's with the tournament manager.
Absolutely.
I think Peter talked to that, but that you as a player have personal responsibility when you are not able to, if you're not coping with the situation, you need to bring that to people's attention.
Yes. And I think the other thing is if you see one of the other players starting to be confused in that, obviously you can't say anything, but you can tell the referee, say, look, I'm a bit concerned, can you keep an eye on them? It's a tricky situation. Somebody mentioned that there was a player not wearing a hat, and I think that's one thing we can actually easily do something about, and that's saying, well, it's hot out there, we expect people to wear hats. So there are things that we can do. If we have confused players and you're not sure, or the referee's not sure, maybe they get another referee and have a chat as well, or talk to the person. If you can go and say, look, how are you? Just checking that you're okay. Where are we? Ask a few questions. Where are we? What time is it? And make sure they answer the questions right. What's the score? Which hoop are we going to next? If they can't answer those sorts of questions, they're confused.
Yeah.
And I think,
and it may be something to consider when you are expecting warm weather, that you do say to players that you do need to ensure that you're prepared for the warm weather, and then you have hats and things to keep you cool and so on. So it seems obvious, but perhaps we need to be a little more specific.
Yes, and I think if it's going to be hot, people should be, they should be out. They should be wearing hats. It's just part of put it in the tournament guidelines that if it's a hot day, and it's sunny, you're expected to wear a hat.
Yeah,
as part of your
because then the
conditions.
tournament manager's got authority that they can use. Otherwise, the person may not take them seriously. There was also just about using the guidelines, which I think were being applied in Adelaide this year. We were still playing in quite hot conditions. So
Yes.
I wasn't sure whether when it's dry, when you don't have high humidity, you can go up to 44 without being in the red zone.
Potentially, yes.
And I'm not. I felt like that was too hot to be playing.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why I said, look, maybe lots of other sports are getting research on, like the football players. Some of them will swallow pills. They actually watch and observe what their core temperatures are getting to, and that might be something we can consider in the future to see what is happening out there, particularly on those hot days with players when they're out there all day playing. How hot are they getting? Because knowing what their core temperature is going to mean that will adjust the guidelines of what it is for the future. They may actually make it lower temperatures. So as I said, if we're standing there, like I can think of probably bowls, and bowls golf is probably similar to croquet. But if you're out there for GC for hours on end, then we may be getting up into the cricket zone, which is just slightly shifting that graph to the left.
Yeah.
Meaning the temperatures will be a bit.
Are there other questions? Sorry. Are there other questions while we still have Karen? You can just take yourself off mute. Oh, Marty's got one.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to hog the question time here, but I need to ask a question. Our club adopted its own extreme heat policy in our weather conditions, in our weather policy, where as soon as our temperature gets above 30 degrees, we are to warn all players that it's starting to get very hot, take precautions and so on. And as soon as it hits 34, we're to stop play. And that's just our club's policy that we've adopted. If a tournament came to our place, like when we ran the ISS and so on, does the tournament itself have its own policy on weather?
Or do we use ours?
I think that what we're trying to do is get a national. What I'd like is a national policy rather than individual club policies, like long term. And what I'd recommend you do is actually get you've got your policy, but go out there and download the app and see what's happening. And put the tool in every time you play croquet, and see where it is on the lines, and seeing what's coming up. My inkling would be to start, rather than just using a blanket number, because if you've got a nice wind coming through, it's going to be completely different as if it's just if there's no wind. Or if you're in the shade as opposed to in the sun. So rather than taking a blanket rule, which may be okay, I'd be I'd start playing with the tool, because I think you'll find using the local forecast and the local BOM and the heat stress guidelines is probably going to give you a bit more accurate advice.
Right. So having just a generalized notation of it, but then go along with the tool itself. So we'll get into that tool.
Yeah, it's
easy. I think. Yeah, I was going to say, Marty, just technically, if it's a Croaky New South Wales event, the policy that should apply should be the state policy. So you may feel the state policy isn't good enough after you've had a look at it, then you would need to talk to the tournaments people to see if you wanted to make some modifications, and that might be given where you are located and so on. But I think if as a player, you want to know that the policy that's being used is applying across the board and is not changing from tournament to tournament. But if you run a club event, I think it's your, you've got more control then.
Yeah.
Okay.
That
So
makes sense.
Marty, where are you?
We're
can you
in
see me?
Newcastle. We're in Newcastle at Glendale.
Okay, so
We're not, even though we're Toronto Croquet Club, we're not down at Toronto, which is
you're at
nice and
Glendale.
breezy and cool.
Yep.
We're at Glendale, which is stinking hot.
Can you see my stuff?
Yes.
So you can see they've gone in for bowls of for Glendale, and I just lost Glendale. Sorry.
There it is. Yeah.
Yep. And I'm just scrolling down. So at the moment it's low, and it's just telling you stay hydrated, wear low clothes. And so that's just telling us for the rest of the day, the forecast. I can't tell you any more than that because we're at the end of the day. So the rest of the week is looking okay, but
So
we can see.
This information is coming from the tool, is it?
This is live. This is me looking it up right now, live, of what's happening.
Using the tool.
Using the tool. So
Great.
I'll just flick up. So this is today. Sorry, I've got a stupid. Hang on, I'll just use. Sorry, I was using my. So this is the tool. So this is right now. This is Friday. Oh, stupid thing. So here's today. So we can see 6 p.m. This is the temperature, and it's not really any issue. So we then go down to Friday, tomorrow, and we can see that so it's still in the low zone, in the yellow zone tomorrow. So each day we can predict the whole week by just scrolling down. So here's Saturday.
Yeah.
Again, almost up to the moderate zone. So
could you look at Tuesday?
So next Tuesday.
No, last Tuesday.
I can't go backwards. I can only go forwards.
Okay. So, the reason I ask is that at the grounds, even before 9 o'clock, the temperature had hit 31 degrees.
Yep.
And it felt very hot.
Yeah, and if you go straight to, and that's where I picked up one of those temperatures that I showed you on the app, and it was I think there might have been Tempe, or even might have been Toronto or Glendale or somewhere when I looked it up. So it's somewhere pretty hot. But if I go to, I'll go to Darwin, just because it'll be hot. Darwin, Northern Territory. Not that they play croquet there, but so this is even now, this time of night, we're still in we're moderate. We're just below the moderate zone. If we go down, you can see here's Darwin this time of day, and they are in their orange zone for this evening. So it's already telling us, look, they're already creeping. Even at nighttime, they're going to be creeping up to being very hot. Here's tomorrow in Darwin. You can see why you don't play croquet in Darwin. Here's tomorrow in Darwin. So essentially, because it's hot and it's humid, and most of the day is going to be in the high risk where you shouldn't be playing. So if you want to play, in Darwin tomorrow, you really have to go sort of 4 to 8 p.m.
Twilight.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's raining then too.
Yeah. But that's the nice advantage of it. It's really easy to use, and I think it's much better than relying on just a temperature, because it will tell us how the humidity is and those sorts of things. It takes all that environmental stuff into account.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Are there any further questions? Bearing in mind that you can watch this again if you wanted to just check some of that information. Karen's given the link to the tool, but do that again if we need to. And I think, Karen, you've responded to all the the questions we've received. So thank you very much for your time and your expertise and your focusing this policy on the croquet world. We very much appreciate it. And hopefully this will help clubs managing their play and their tournaments as we head into the summer season.
All right.
So thanks, everybody.
Can I just say one thing? Look, if people are not sure what to do and then unsure, just give me a ring. Give me a ring and say, Karen, the tournament's coming up and we don't know how to manage it. What do you recommend? And I'm happy to, give some advice too.
So perhaps we'll put something on the website, Karen. Would that be appropriate? Or in the next newsletter? Something like that. Yeah. Okay. We'll have a chat about that. So people can do that. That's a really generous offer.
Yeah. Probably best to ring me in the evenings and not during the day.
Yeah, good thinking. Maybe a message. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. We'll let you get to your dinner. Thanks, Rick. We'll turn off the recording now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Is it an app or a website?
Okay.